Tonight, we are witnessing something that almost no American alive today has ever seen: a quiet fracture along the world's most peaceful, stable, and trusted border. A crack between the United States and Canada, two nations that have spent more than a century acting not just like neighbors, but like extensions of each other. But something changed, something subtle, something silent, something that the media barely touched. But experts are calling a continental shift, because for the first time in modern history, Canada has openly declared that it wants economic planning independent of the United States, not collaborative, not aligned, not integrated, independent. And in Washington, that statement landed like a diplomatic grenade. This isn't just about money. This isn't just about trade. This is about trust, about confidence, about whether America is still stable enough, economically, politically, and strategically, to anchor the region the way it has for the last 80 years. To understand why this moment is so explosive, we need to understand the relationship itself. The US-Canada relationship is not a normal relationship. These aren't two countries trading across oceans. These are nations whose economies are fused, literally fused, through pipelines, power grids, railways, highways, and industries built to mirror each other. Every day, more than $3 billion crosses the border: food, oil, steel, lumber, cars, technology, medical supplies. America needs Canada's resources. Canada needs America's market. For decades, both sides assumed that this bond was unbreakable, permanent, automatic, a relationship so stable that politicians didn't even think about it until now, because Canada just told the world that it can no longer rely on the United States, not because of war, not because of ideology, but because of instability. Think about that word, instability. When Canada looks at the United States today, here's what it sees: a political system tearing itself apart, elections questioned, institutions under pressure, debt exploding, interest rates unpredictable, a currency fighting inflation, trade policies shifting every 4 years, geopolitical commitments constantly changing. From Canada's perspective, the US isn't a stable anchor anymore. It's a storm, and no country, not even America's closest friend, wants its economy tied to a storm. So for the first time in decades, Canada is building two futures: one future where the United States remains strong and the old partnership continues, and a second future where America slips, staggers, or shifts, and Canada must survive without it. This is the part Washington didn't see coming, because while American politicians argue on TV, Canada has been quietly making moves: new trade routes with Europe, new energy deals in Asia, new immigration pipelines to rebuild its workforce, a new industrial strategy built on self-reliance, not American dependence, a new defense posture shaped by global uncertainty. Canada is preparing for a world where the US might no longer be the automatic center of gravity. And that preparation, that silent planning, is what has Washington on edge. You don't just make a backup plan unless you think something is going wrong. And Canada clearly thinks something is going wrong. Economists in Ottawa didn't mince their words. They warned that the American economy has become volatile, that US internal politics create unpredictable shockwaves, and that relying on the US dollar and US market puts Canada at strategic risk. Think tanks in Washington heard that and immediately raised red flags. One analyst said, if Canada is preparing for a post-American world, the rest of the world will follow. Why? Because Canada is America's closest, most aligned, most historically stable ally. If Canada is losing confidence, the message is something fundamental is shifting inside the United States. And here's the part that makes this story truly historic. This economic independence message didn't come from a fringe politician. It came from the Canadian government itself. Clear, deliberate, calculated, a rare public signal that they are no longer willing to stake their economy on America's internal turbulence. Let's go deeper. For nearly 40 years, Canada benefited massively from American growth. When the US grew, Canada grew. When the US consumed, Canada exported. When the US invested, Canada industrialized. But now, the American economy is flashing warning signs: inflation that refuses to fully calm, rates that punish households, debt cliffs nobody wants to talk about, and political polarization that makes long term planning impossible. A country cannot rely on a partner that cannot rely on itself. That's the truth behind Canada's shift. And the timing, that's not an accident. Canada sees Europe hedging, Canada sees Asia rising, Canada sees Middle Eastern powers rebalancing, Canada sees global institutions weakening, Canada sees alliances reorganizing. The world is moving toward multipolarity, a world where the US isn't the sole economic sun that everyone orbits. So Canada is positioning itself early, carefully, quietly, but decisively. This is why US analysts are calling it the first strategic divergence between the US and Canada in modern history. Because once a nation starts planning for independence, it doesn't suddenly reverse course. It continues, it expands, it accelerates. The big question now is, if Canada moves away, even slowly, what does that mean for the North American system? What happens to trade? What happens to energy? What happens to manufacturing? What happens to defense cooperation? What happens to future technology pipelines? And most important, what happens when other allies, who are already watching America with concern, decide to follow Canada's lead? Because Canada never acts alone. Canada is respected. Canada is trusted. Canada is the reasonable ally, the stable partner, the reliable democracy. So when Canada doubts America, the world pays attention. And tonight, for the first time, that doubt is out in the open. Canada's doubt didn't appear overnight. It built slowly, year after year, as the United States grew more unpredictable. Canadian economists watched as trade wars erupted without warning. They watched as tariffs were slapped on steel, aluminum, lumber, industries that Canada depends on for hundreds of thousands of jobs. They watched as immigration policies swung violently from one administration to the next, threatening skilled labor pipelines that Canada relies on. Every 4 years, the rules changed, the tone changed, the direction changed. And for a country like Canada, which plans its economic future in long, stable cycles, America's political whiplash became impossible to rely on. Inside closed door meetings, Canadian strategists began saying something quietly. We need contingency plans. That phrase transformed into, we need parallel systems, and eventually into what the world is hearing now. We need independence in economic planning. This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't anger. It was survival. Canada saw something that very few Americans see from the inside. The United States is no longer predictable. One election can erase the policies of the previous 4 years. Trade deals can be renegotiated overnight. Alliances can shift with a single speech. And for Canada, whose entire economic infrastructure is intertwined with America, that instability is not just inconvenient, it is dangerous. So Canada began laying the foundations for a different future. New shipping ports built to face Europe instead of just the US. New energy terminals designed for Asia. New alliances with India, Japan, South Korea, Germany, and France. New tech cooperation deals that don't run through Washington. A new central bank plan that reduces reliance on American monetary moves. A new immigration strategy to build a workforce resilient to American cycles. Slowly, steadily, Canada started preparing itself to be a country that can survive no matter what happens south of the border. Washington didn't notice at first. Why would it? For decades, the US assumed Canada would never drift away. The relationship was too old, too profitable, too comfortable, but that comfort became blindness. America forgot that allies, even the closest ones, also do what's best for themselves. And when the United States became volatile, Canada did what any rational nation would do. It built a life raft. People in Washington are now asking the same question: what does Canada see coming? Because countries don't change 50 years of strategy without a reason. They don't signal independence unless they believe dependence is risky. And they certainly don't challenge America's economic centrality unless they think America's grip is slipping. The truth is, Canada sees global power shifting. It sees China rising. It sees Europe building autonomy. It sees the Middle East reconfiguring. It sees the global South gaining leverage. And in all this turbulence, the United States, once the most stable force on Earth, is struggling to maintain the same level of predictability it once commanded. Canada can't afford to sit quietly and hope everything in America goes back to normal. It can't afford trade shocks every election cycle. It can't afford policy reversals every 4 years. It can't afford markets that move not because of global forces, but because of domestic chaos. So it is hedging, just like Europe hedged, just like Japan hedged, just like the entire world is learning to hedge. Because the global system that America built after World War II, the system everyone trusted, no longer feels guaranteed. The most fascinating part is how carefully Canada chose its words. It didn't say it was separating from the United States. It didn't say it was rejecting the US alliance. It didn't say it was breaking away. Instead, it said something much more strategic. We are planning independently. Those three words change everything. They give Canada freedom without provoking America. They signal preparation without signaling hostility. They protect the economy without creating panic, but they also send a message to every investor, every government, every multinational corporation. Canada is no longer assuming America will be stable. And that message is powerful because when a calm, rational, cautious country like Canada makes such a move, it forces everyone else to reevaluate their assumptions. If Canada is planning independently, should others? If Canada is adjusting for risk, does that mean the risk is real? If Canada is preparing for uncertainty, what does it know that the world doesn't? American officials, behind closed doors, understand the implications. They know this isn't just a Canada story. This is the beginning of a reevaluation of American economic dominance. Allies are quietly building alternatives. Competitors are challenging old structures. And the world that once revolved around Washington is slowly tilting away. Canada's shift is a warning signal, not loud, not aggressive, but unmistakable. It says, the world is changing and we must change with it. But the deeper question remains, what pushed Canada to make this move now? Why not 5 years ago? Why not later? Why choose this moment at a time when global tensions are rising everywhere? Some analysts say it's because Canada no longer trusts American political stability. Others say it's because of the unpredictable economic swings that keep hitting both nations. Others believe it's because Canada fears that the next decade will be defined by great power rivalry between the US and China, and no country wants to be caught in the middle without a backup plan. Maybe all of them are right. What we do know is that Canada has reached a point where it cannot leave its future entirely in America's hands. It is still a friend, still an ally, still a partner, but no longer a dependent. And that shift, subtle, quiet, polite, is enormous. Behind the scenes, Canadian business leaders have been calling for this change for years. They warned that over-reliance on American markets was a structural weakness. They warned that American domestic politics could disrupt supply chains. They warned that diversifying trade was not optional, it was essential. And now the government is acting on those warnings. This moment matters because it symbolizes something larger than just a policy choice. It symbolizes a psychological shift. For the first time, Canada is imagining a future where America is not the automatic answer, not the automatic anchor, not the automatic economic engine. That mental shift is the true turning point, because once a nation begins to imagine a new path, that path becomes real. This is why experts are calling this the first quiet fracture in the North American model. Not dramatic, not hostile, but real. A strategic decoupling, slow enough to avoid conflict, fast enough to change the future. And the United States now has a decision to make. Ignore this signal or confront the reality that even its closest ally is adjusting to a world where American stability is no longer guaranteed. Canada has made its move. The question now is how Washington reacts, with denial or with adaptation. And that reaction will shape the next decade. But while Washington debates what this means, Canada is already moving forward. Inside Ottawa, the tone has shifted from reaction to preparation. Experts in the finance department are mapping out scenarios. What happens if the US faces another government shutdown? What if a future administration imposes surprise tariffs again? What if political gridlock freezes stimulus measures during a recession? What if interest rates diverge sharply? What if the US dollar experiences volatility that spills over into Canadian markets? And most importantly, what if the United States enters a period of long-term instability? These are questions Canadian leaders never had to ask before. Now they're running models, simulations, forecasts, not because they want to abandon the United States, but because they can no longer afford not to. Quietly, Canada is building buffers, strategic reserves, diversified trade lanes, new critical minerals partnerships, expanded immigration targets to strengthen economic growth independent of US cycles, renewable energy exports planned for Europe and Asia, a digital payment strategy that aligns with multiple global blocs, not just Washington. Every move Canada makes now carries the same message. We cannot put all our weight on one pillar. For decades, the US was that pillar, strong, predictable, stable, but even the strongest pillar can crack. America is still powerful, still wealthy, still innovative, still militarily unmatched. But on the economic and political front, the consistency that once defined it is slipping. And that is exactly what makes Canada's shift so impactful. It's not about strength, it's about consistency. Allies don't fear that the US is weak, they fear that the US is unpredictable. They fear that the rules may change without warning. They fear that political polarization may turn economic strategy into a weapon. That fear transforms relationships, not through conflict, but through caution. Right now, Canada is not turning away from the United States. It is stepping sideways. It is preparing for a world where the US might not always be able to offer stability on demand. And if this sounds like a minor adjustment, it isn't. Because when your largest trading partner, responsible for 75% of your exports, suddenly becomes less predictable, the entire economic architecture must be redesigned. That redesign has already begun. Canadian universities are expanding research ties with Europe and Japan. Canadian mining companies are partnering with India instead of relying solely on US buyers. Canadian banks are exploring settlement systems that reduce exposure to fluctuations in the US dollar. Multinational corporations operating in Canada are being encouraged to expand supply chains toward Europe and Asia. Even in the energy sector, where the US and Canada have been deeply intertwined for decades, new pipelines, new export terminals, and new maritime partners signal a future with multiple customers, not just one. Meanwhile, Washington is waking up to a reality it never expected. Canada may be the ally, the partner, the neighbor that stays closest, but even the closest ally is beginning to diversify, not because it wants to leave, but because it wants to survive any storm the US might accidentally create. And these storms are becoming more frequent. Government shutdown threats every year, debt ceiling crises, trade war rhetoric, currency fluctuations, inflation spikes, rapid interest rate swings that ripple through global markets. Nations don't forget these things, they plan for them. Canada is simply planning earlier than others. What truly worries US analysts is the symbolism. If Canada, the calm, stable, diplomatic, non-alignment prone Canada, feels the need to prepare for independence, what message does that send to Europe? To Japan, to South Korea, to Mexico, to Australia? These countries rely on the US too. They watch America's domestic turmoil carefully. If they see Canada hedging, they may begin doing the same. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, piece by piece, until American dependence becomes a choice, not a necessity. That is what Washington fears most. Not losing allies, but losing automatic alignment. Losing the assumption that every major partner will always follow America's lead simply because they always have. The world is changing, and Canada's move is one of the clearest signs. But inside Canada, this is not being framed as a separation. It is being framed as maturity, a nation finally standing on its own economic feet, ready to operate in a multipolar world. A world where the US is still important, but not exclusive. A world where influence is shared, not centralized. A world where reliability is measured not through military alliances, but through economic stability. Canada sees this future coming. And rather than resisting it, it is preparing for it. The real question is whether the US is prepared too. What makes this shift even more fascinating is how quietly it's happening. There are no speeches criticizing America, no public confrontations, no declarations of divergence. Canada is moving in silence, and silent moves are often the most strategic. Loud breaks can be repaired, quiet shifts become permanent. When a nation changes direction with calm calculation rather than emotional reaction, the new path tends to stick. And Canada's new path is becoming clearer every month. More autonomy, more diversification, more independence in economic planning, more protection against American volatility, more global engagement that does not pass through Washington. This doesn't weaken the alliance, it transforms it. A dependent Canada was predictable. An independent Canada is strategic, and strategic partners shape their own futures. This is the kind of shift that historians don't recognize immediately. It doesn't come with headlines. It doesn't come with drama. It comes with data. Trade percentages slowly shifting, investment flows quietly rerouting, policy language subtly changing, and by the time the world realizes what has happened, the shift is complete. The most important change is psychological. Once a nation learns that it can create alternatives, it never returns to dependence. Canada has crossed that threshold. The United States didn't push it away, but it didn't provide enough stability to keep it close either. So Canada chose resilience over reliance, preparation over assumption, autonomy over uncertainty. And that choice may be one of the most consequential strategic decisions of the decade. In the end, this is not a breakup. It is not a crisis. It is a recalibration, a quiet rewriting of expectations. Canada will always remain America's neighbor, partner, and ally. But the era of Canada building its entire economic future around the United States is ending. A new era, one defined by balance, independence, and strategic diversification, has already begun. And the world will feel its effects far beyond North America. Because when even the closest allies prepare for uncertainty in the American system, it signals a global transformation that no one can afford to ignore. This is the moment we are living through. It won't make dramatic headlines, but it will reshape the next decade in ways we are only beginning to understand.